The John Wick franchise has redefined the action film genre.
It's crazy.
With each new installment costing more than its predecessor and yet still quadrupling its initial investment. Just like The Matrix, John Wick has its own set of principles. It has its own style of fighting scenes, with its own style of stunts, and it follows its own rules for lighting, executing, and capturing those scenes. And just like The Matrix, each new John Wick installment is bigger, more extravagant, and more expensive than the one before. But unlike The Matrix, each installment of John Wick actually improved on the previous one. And this is because the John Wick franchise has remained true to its filming principles, no matter how complicated the scene was or how hard it was to achieve. In general, Hollywood action scenes tend to be close-up, quick and snappy, and the main reason for this is to add speed and energy to the sequence. John Wick's action is generally steady wide shots with as few cuts as possible, and this makes them easier to follow, more dramatic and visually pleasing. But it also means that every actor has to be extremely well trained and every scene has to be incredibly well planned. And this perhaps can be seen most clearly in the Paris house scene, otherwise known on set as the top shot. It had complex choreography, dog attacks, exploding shotgun rounds and stunts, muzzle flashes and bullet impacts, dust, debris and pyro elements, and wirework and smashing mirrors. It had a tremendous number of independent parts that all had to come together at precisely the right time and exactly the right place. Because any slight error meant that everything would have to be reset and they'd have to start again from the beginning. But with so many components to control, it is virtually impossible for absolutely everything to go well in the same take. So the filmmakers would either have to reduce the number of components in the sequence or add more cuts. And this was a compromise that they just weren't willing to make, so they turned to visual effects. On set, they decided to use plug-fire cap guns. These are prop guns that for safety reasons don't fire blanks, but they do recoil and eject cartridges. The VFX teams would then have to add the muzzle flash and smoke in post and time it to these cartridge ejections. In fact, most of the scene's pyro effects were left to the VFX teams. The smashing mirrors were just framed green screen fabric on set, and later replaced with practical elements that were filmed independently. And the flying papers, debris and blood were also added afterward. By handing over all of the dangerous, the complex and the unpredictable elements to the VFX team, the filmmakers could concentrate on the fight's choreography, framing and timing, making sure that everything happened when it needed to, and that it coincided with everything else. The Arc de Triomphe sequence was another example of the John Wick filmmakers' unwillingness to conform for less. Even though they managed to get permission to film in places like the Garnier Palace Opera House, the Louvre, the Sacred Heart Church, and the Versailles Palace, the Arc de Triomphe was a different story. 12 major roads converge on this 8-lane roundabout that sees hundreds of thousands of vehicles daily. This meant it would be virtually impossible for them to get permission to film there, let alone shut it down completely to be able to perform the car stunts safely. But instead of changing their plans and sourcing an easier location, once again, they turned to the VFX team. Rodeo FX had to meticulously recreate every detail of the Parisian roundabout, including cobblestone roads. They began by building the assets using all the data they could find online, including a LiDAR file of the Place de l'Étoile. Then they set up a template of the Arc location at the Tempelhof Airport in Berlin, where principal photography was going to be shot. Then they took the footage they shot at Tempelhof and transported it into their CG Arc de Triomphe world. They tried to keep as much of the original footage as possible, keeping Keanu, the Barracuda, and the other stunt drivers and cars intact. Rodeo FX was even able to mix the concrete into the cobblestone in areas allowing them to keep practical water spray and to avoid needing CG wheels or CG broken glass. But even so, they still had to use 2 different car simulations for the cars in the background and hand animate the approximately 1,500 cars in the foreground and middle ground that interacted with the stunt cars. The goal was to keep as many stunt vehicles as possible to drive the action of the sequence. But even when they kept a real vehicle, they still had to body track it in order to add reflections of their CG Paris environment and reflect its front and rear lights onto the CG vehicles and environment. And on top of all this, they still had to add the hits, muzzle flashes, sparks, and paint chips. In fact, the John Wick filmmaker's willingness to go to any lengths to achieve a shot isn't just apparent in the big action scenes, but also in the little details too. In this shot, they wanted John Wick to pick up his gun whilst power sliding around a corner. But this created its own set of problems. First, Keanu had trouble knowing where the gun was as the car passed over it, so they drew a white line on the road so he had a reference point. Then he had trouble grabbing it, so they stuck Velcro to the gun and gave him a Velcro glove. Then they had to repeat it until they got it to look smooth. And then the VFX teams had to replace the Velcro glove with a CG hand and remove the white chalk line. Another little detail was in this scene. When they filmed it, it was actually foggy and the top of the tower couldn't be seen. However, during a test viewing, the audience thought that the VFX teams had forgotten to put the spire in. So the spire you're seeing here is actually CGI. And the train in the Paris subway scene looked too clean to belong in the Wick universe. So they added CG graffiti. A large part of John Wick's success comes from knowing exactly when and when not to, and exactly how and how not to use visual effects. And this can be summed up most simply in this stunt where John jumps out of a window and falls onto a van. The majority of filmmakers would have just had a stuntman fall from the window onto some mats and then hand over to a digidouble and digital van for the impact. But John Wick actually had the stuntman perform a second jump straight onto the van from lower down, and the van had special pistons installed to make it crumple inwards. VFX were only used to stitch the jump from the window and the jump onto the van together, and to add some CG glass to help sell the impact.